Hi, I'm Imi. I'm the author of Mapping the Human Mind. If you've just found this video today, I've been reading a chapter of my book each week. They can be listened to on their own, so don't worry about needing to start from the beginning. You can just pick and choose the topics that you're interested in. I'll be reading the entire book too. This week I'm reading Chapter 8, The Islamic Golden Age and Cultural Exchange. You stand in the ruined Forum of Rome circa 600 CE. Weeds grow between cracked marble slabs. Goats graze where senators once debated. The whispers of Latin rhetoric have been replaced by the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the occasional shuffle of a monk's cloak in worn wool. Once this was the centre of the world, a place where law, philosophy and engineering reached heights unparalleled. Now its libraries are burned, its schools abandoned. As Europe descended into the fragmented patchwork of feudal territories we call the Dark Ages, though historians hate this term, the intellectual flame wasn't extinguished, it was passed to new hands. Literacy, once the mark of Roman bureaucrats and aristocrats, became the domain of monks cloistered in monasteries. By candlelight they copied text by hand, preserving fragments of knowledge, yet much of this remained locked away, inaccessible to all but a select few. Cities shrank, trade slowed, and Europe's intellectual energy dimmed, but it never disappeared. While the West grappled with instability, other civilizations flourished. The Byzantine Empire, inheritors of Rome's Eastern legacy, maintained an unbroken scholarly tradition of Greek philosophy and Christian theology. In Persia, the Sassanid Empire preserved and expanded scientific knowledge from India and Greece. But the most unexpected intellectual awakening was about to take place in a region often overlooked in discussions of philosophy and science, the deserts of Arabia. Because knowledge, like water, does not disappear, it flows. And as the West struggled through its period of fragmentation and instability, the torch of learning was carried elsewhere. The scent of ink and parchment mingles with the spice-laden air as you walk through the bustling streets of Damascus, Cairo and Cordoba. Scribes lean over wooden desks, their pens scratching across pages as they copy texts rescued from the ruins of Alexandria and Antioch. Translations flow into Arabic, expanding ideas, sparking debate, weaving threads from many worlds into something new. Here, philosophy walks hand in hand with faith. Medicine is no longer magic, but a science grounded in cause and effect. The night sky isn't read for omens, it's mapped, measured and studied as a realm of celestial mechanics. This is where the world's greatest intellectual traditions, Greek, Persian, Indian, are not just preserved, but refined, tested and transformed. The rise of Islam has forged an empire not only of land and faith, but of the mind. In the very cities that Roman legions once ruled, a new empire of thought is being built, one that will do more than safeguard the wisdom of the past. It will elevate it, challenge it, and eventually pass it back to the very civilization that had forgotten it. The year is 610 CE. The Arabian Peninsula is a land of harsh contrasts. Sun-scorched dunes and lush oasis towns, wandering Bedouin tribes and bustling trade hubs. Mecca, one such hub, sits at the crossroads of the ancient world, its markets alive with the exchange of goods, ideas and stories carried by merchants from as far as Byzantium and India. Now shift your gaze to a solitary figure on Mount Hira, a rocky outcrop just outside Mecca. The air is cool, the desert stars brilliant overhead. A man sits in deep meditation, seeking solace in the silence, away from the corruption of the city below. He is Muhammad, a merchant by trade, known for his honesty and contemplation. But tonight something extraordinary happens. A voice breaks the silence. "Read," it commands. He trembles. "I cannot read," he replies. The voice comes again. "Read in the name of your Lord who created man from a clinging clot." The weight of these words presses upon him, marking the beginning of a revelation that will change history. Over the next 20 years, Muhammad will receive further revelations, forming the foundation of Islam, a faith that will not only reshape religion, but become one of the greatest catalysts for intellectual growth the world has ever seen. Within a century of Muhammad's death, his followers will establish one of history's most remarkable empires, stretching from Spain to India. And unlike the shattered remnants of Rome, this empire will embrace learning as a divine mandate. The words of the Quran repeatedly emphasize the importance of knowledge. Are those who know equal to those who do not know? Quran 39:9. The Prophet is widely reported, though in a weakly sourced tradition, to have said, "Seek knowledge even unto China," a phrase that captures the spirit of Islam's reverence for learning and exploration. This is no accident. In Islam, knowledge is not just practical, it is sacred. The quest for understanding is a form of worship, a means of drawing closer to the divine. Empire of the Mind. By the 8th century, the Islamic world stretched from the sun-baked shores of Spain to the tropical heat of India's Sindh province. Imagine the scenes as Arab horsemen rode into Alexandria, Damascus and Ctesiphon, cities with ancient libraries and scholarly traditions. These were not campaigns of cultural erasure. The armies arrived not with torches, but with orders to protect what they found. The early caliphs, particularly the Abbasids, who established their capital at Baghdad in 762 CE, saw themselves not just as military leaders, but as patrons of knowledge. Within Islamic belief, the pursuit of knowledge is a religious and moral imperative rooted in Quranic teachings and the Prophet's sayings. Under this divine mandate, Islamic scholars didn't view Greek philosophy or Persian mathematics as foreign threats, but as part of the broader human inheritance entrusted to them by God, Allah, whose name in Arabic reflects the same monotheistic tradition. Baghdad's intellectual supernova. Baghdad, 9th century, not the worn-torn city of modern headlines, but the glittering jewel of medieval civilization. A metropolis of perhaps 1 million people when London held barely 20,000. At its heart stands the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. You enter through its grand archways into the hum of intellectual life. The air is thick with the scent of oil lamps and paper. Sunlight filters through latticed windows, casting golden patterns across long tables where scholars hunch over manuscripts. The soft scratching of reed pens blends with the quiet murmur of debate in Arabic, Persian, Syriac, and Greek. This was no ordinary archive. It marked the dawn of collaborative, cross-cultural scholarship. Here, under the patronage of Caliph al-Ma'mun, 813 to 833 CE, teams of scholars worked to translate the wisdom of earlier civilizations. Imagine the excitement as works thought lost forever emerged from distant monasteries and libraries. Medical texts by Galen, astronomical observations from India, mathematical treatises from Persia, and most crucially, the philosophical corpus of Aristotle, Plato, and other Greek thinkers. Camel caravans arrived bearing precious scrolls from Constantinople, payments from a Byzantine emperor to the Muslim caliph, knowledge valued literally at its weight in gold. But the scholars at the House of Wisdom weren't content merely to preserve. Each translation sparked new ideas, commentary, and innovation. The paper mill, imported from China and improved in Baghdad, churned out the material that would carry this knowledge across the Islamic world and eventually back to Europe. Without paper, cheaper and more durable than parchment or papyrus, the explosion of book production that fueled the Islamic Golden Age would have been impossible. As you walk the narrow streets outside the House of Wisdom, you pass booksellers' stalls piled high with bound volumes, a sight unseen in Europe for centuries. Nearby, a public library offers its treasures to anyone seeking knowledge. In a world where a single book in Europe might cost as much as a farm, Baghdad boasted bookshops and libraries that would have dazzled even the Romans at their height. The great minds of the Islamic Golden Age. While religious scholars debated theology in the mosques, Islamic philosophers weren't content to simply translate Greek works. They engaged with them, challenged them, and built upon them, producing a fusion of knowledge that would redefine human understanding. This intellectual cross-pollination had profound implications for psychology, epistemology, and consciousness studies, laying the foundation for fields that wouldn't even be named for centuries. These thinkers weren't working in isolation. They were part of a vibrant ecosystem of inquiry, where philosophy, medicine, and metaphysics intertwined. Among them was a scholar whose influence would echo through centuries of thought, bridging Aristotle's logic with new models of consciousness. The second teacher. There's a small gathering in 10th century Baghdad. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows as a group sits in rapt attention around an aging scholar. This is Abu Nazir al-Farabi, known as the second teacher, Aristotle being the first. Al-Farabi's thin fingers trace diagrams in the air as he explains his vision of the cosmos, a hierarchy of being descended from the divine intellect down to the material world. But his most fascinating insights concern the human mind itself. The soul, he explains, is not simply a thing but a process, drawing on Aristotle but moving beyond him. Al-Farabi describes how the mind processes reality in stages: sense, perception, imagination, and finally rational thought. His innovations included detailed explorations of how we form concepts and abstract ideas from our sensory experiences. For Al-Farabi, consciousness wasn't just a philosophical curiosity, but the bridge between the material and spiritual realms. His writings on music theory explored how specific sounds could induce particular states of consciousness, perhaps the first systematic study of music psychology. The self before Descartes. Now we travel to 11th century Persia, to a physician's quarters where another philosophical giant works, Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, is perhaps the greatest mind of the medieval Islamic world. Picture him pausing in his medical investigations to explore something even more fundamental, the nature of consciousness itself. To demonstrate the reality of the soul, Avicenna proposes a thought experiment that would presage Descartes' famous "I think, therefore I am" by some 600 years. Imagine, he says, a person created suddenly in midair, floating with no sensory contact, unable to see, hear, or feel anything, even their own body. Would such a person be aware of their own existence? Avicenna argues yes, they would still know their own consciousness even without sensory data. He would not affirm the existence of any of his parts, but he would affirm the existence of his self, he writes. In this floating man experiment, Avicenna lays the groundwork for understanding self-awareness as something fundamental to human existence, an insight that would not be rediscovered in Europe until the dawn of modern philosophy. By the time of his death, he would produce over 400 works, including the Canon of Medicine, which would remain a medical authority in both East and West for nearly 600 years. Seeing the mind through the eye. Travel now to Cairo in the early 11th century. In a small room, a man sits in the subtle light filtered through a pinhole in a curtain. He watches intently as the image of the busy street outside projects upside down on the opposite wall. This is Ibn al-Haytham, known in Latin as Alhazen, conducting the world's first camera obscura experiment as part of his groundbreaking work on optics. But al-Haytham isn't just studying light, he's investigating perception itself. Unlike earlier thinkers who believed that eyes emitted rays that allowed us to see, al-Haytham demonstrated that light enters the eye from external objects. More revolutionary still was his understanding that vision isn't passive reception, but active interpretation. The judgment of sight, he writes, does not perceive the shape of the visible object by the form itself, rather it perceives it through the mediation of another thing. In other words, what we see is constructed by the mind, not simply received by the eyes. A foundational concept for all future understanding of perception and consciousness. He described how the brain completes patterns, fills in blind spots, and integrates sensory information, concepts that wouldn't be fully developed in Western psychology until the 19th century. The spice market bustles outside his window, each coloured powder and aromatic herb a data point in al-Haytham's investigation of how the mind perceives colour, depth and movement. As evening falls, he writes by lamplight, documenting experiments conducted with mathematical precision, the first true application of the scientific method. The transmission of knowledge. While Islamic scholars were expanding human knowledge, Europe was slowly emerging from its post-Roman fragmentation. By the 11th century, conditions were finally ripe for a remarkable cultural exchange that would transform Western thought. For centuries, much of Europe had been cut off from the intellectual traditions of antiquity. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire had fractured the continent into feudal kingdoms, where literacy and learning were largely confined to monastic communities. While monks carefully copied classical texts, they often did so without engaging in the kind of analysis, experimentation, and synthesis that characterized the Islamic Golden Age. But by the 11th century, Europe was changing, feudalism was stabilizing, cities were growing, and cathedral schools, precursors to the great universities, were beginning to emerge. The demand for education was increasing, driven by a new class of bureaucrats, clergy, and merchants who needed knowledge beyond scripture. This intellectual revival created an opening. Europe was no longer just clinging on to the scraps of classical learning, it was increasingly positioned to engage with, absorb, and build upon new knowledge. The intellectual bridge. Walking through the streets of Cordoba in the 10th century, capital of Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus, the city boasts paved lit streets, public baths and running water, amenities that had vanished from most European cities. More impressive still are its intellectual treasures, a library of 400,000 volumes when the largest Christian libraries held perhaps a few hundred books. The great mosque of Cordoba rises above the city, its forest of red and white arches creating a geometric rhythm that seems to extend to infinity. But just as striking is the harmony among the city's population. Muslims, Christians and Jews living and working together in what historians called the convivencia, coexistence. In the Jewish quarter you might glimpse Moses Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher, deep in conversation with Muslim scholars. Nearby Christian translators from Northern Europe, drawn by the intellectual riches unavailable in their homelands, pore over Arabic texts. This intellectual borderland, where Islamic, Jewish and Christian thought overlapped, provided the perfect conditions for knowledge transfer. Ideas could cross religious and cultural boundaries more easily here than anywhere else in the medieval world. The rediscovery of Aristotle. In a quiet study in 12th century Cordoba, an Islamic judge and physician named Ibn Rushd, known in Latin as Averroes, is engaged in a monumental task, writing detailed commentaries on virtually the entire surviving corpus of Aristotle. His pen moves steadily across the page as he navigates between faith and reason. Unlike many Christian theologians who viewed Aristotle's rational approach with suspicion, Averroes saw no contradiction between philosophical inquiry and religious truth, famously declaring, "Truth does not contradict truth." His commentaries didn't just clarify Aristotle, they transformed him, integrating 6 centuries of Islamic philosophical development. When these texts eventually reached Christian Europe, they didn't just reintroduce Aristotle, they presented a sophisticated philosophical system that had evolved far beyond its Greek origins. The oil lamp casts Averroes' shadow against the whitewashed wall as he works late into the night. He doesn't know it, but his shadow will stretch across centuries, influencing Thomas Aquinas, Dante, who placed him in limbo among the virtuous pagans, and even Raphael, who would include him in the school of Athens painting, alongside the greatest minds of antiquity. The Great Translation Movement. By the 12th century, European scholars finally recognised the intellectual treasures held in the Islamic world. A massive translation movement began, centred initially in Spain and Sicily, both places where Islamic and Christian cultures met. In the scriptoriums of Toledo, Spain, teams of multilingual scholars huddle over thick manuscripts, their voices low and deliberate. A Muslim or Jewish scholar reads the Arabic text aloud, translating it into the local Romance dialect. Besides them, a Christian scholar listens closely, carefully rendering each phrase into Latin. The work is painstaking, often slow, occasionally imprecise, but it opens a channel of knowledge into Europe that had been closed for centuries. From these collaborative efforts, the very vocabulary of Western science begins to take shape. Words like algebra, algorithm, alkali, and alcohol pass from Arabic into Latin, embedding themselves into the intellectual DNA of Europe. In Sicily, at the court of Frederick II, a similar process unfolds. The Norman king, himself fluent in 6 languages, establishes a multicultural court where Greek, Arabic, and Latin scholars work side by side. From these centres, the newly translated work spread north into the emerging universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, intellectual catalysts that would transform medieval Europe. By the 13th century, the impact of these translations were rippling through Europe's intellectual foundations. What began as a cautious curiosity was becoming a full-scale reawakening through the true source of light that was rarely acknowledged. The true legacy. The Renaissance is often portrayed as Europe rediscovering classical learning after the Dark Ages. Walk through any museum's Renaissance gallery and you'll see paintings celebrating this narrative. Europeans blowing dust off ancient Greek texts as if they'd simply been waiting in attics for thousands of years, but the truth is far more interesting. Europe wasn't rediscovering Greek thought directly, it was receiving it through the Islamic world's preservation, correction, and expansion of that knowledge. The Aristotle who transformed European philosophy wasn't just the Greek philosopher in translation. He was Aristotle as interpreted, challenged, and developed by centuries of Islamic scholarship. It's not simply a matter of Arabs storing Greek books until Europeans were ready for them again. Islamic scholars had actively engaged with these ideas, corrected errors, resolved contradictions, conducted new experiments, and added entire fields of knowledge unknown to the ancients. When Copernicus revolutionized astronomy by placing the sun at the center of the solar system, he was building on mathematical models developed by astronomers in Damascus and Samarkand. When European doctors began treating patients instead of just theorising about humours, they were following clinical approaches pioneered in Cairo and Baghdad. When Renaissance artists mastered perspective, they were applying optical principles described by Ibn al-Haytham. And the very notion of a university, a place where scholars from different disciplines gather to both preserve and advance knowledge, owes more to the House of Wisdom than to the Academy of Plato. The scientific method itself, with its emphasis on observation, hypothesis, and experimental verification, was systematically developed by scholars like Ibn al-Haytham centuries before Francis Bacon formalised it in Europe. This transformation of knowledge, preserved, expanded, and ultimately returned, created a remarkable intellectual bridge across time and cultures. In the great libraries of Cordoba, Baghdad, and Cairo, the works of ancient philosophers found new life, new interpretations, and new applications. The questions and answers developed in these centres of learning would eventually help awaken Europe from its intellectual slumber. But this journey of ideas was not yet complete. While the Islamic world preserved and expanded ancient wisdom from the West, another civilization maintained its own unbroken connection to classical learning. In Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire stood as the direct inheritor of Rome's legacy, creating its own synthesis of classical thought and Christian theology, a synthesis that would eventually collide with both Islamic and Western intellectual traditions in ways both creative and destructive. The scientific, philosophical, and medical advances of the Islamic Golden Age remind us that knowledge transcends cultural and religious boundaries. The flow of ideas across civilizations doesn't follow straight lines. Instead, it meanders like a river, finding unexpected channels, forming new tributaries, and occasionally flooding the landscape it traverses, transforming them forever. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Narrative.